So, hi all, and today I would like to revise a topic that I, telling the truth, never articulated in in practice as itself, but that I've talked about extensively in other videos. That is essentially the autonomistic tendencies within the kingdoms of Carolingian tradition. That is, as you know, if you have checked other videos I made about the Carolingians, especially in the dedicated playlist, is a bit the dominant theme of the whole thing, because it wasn't something that you can spot just as a consequence of the end of the Carolingian Empire, but it's a phenomenon whose roots really lay deep within the same, I would say, Frankish, rather even more than Carolingian society. Paradoxically, the Carolingians, although creating this Vassallatic-Beneficiary system from which eventually the centralization of public power would take place, developing ultimately in the feudal system that is a bit the peak of this phenomenon of decentralization. They had actually tried to put a stop to that, because being the ones who had accelerated it in order to form the empire, through essentially compensating these faithful warriors, eventually named counts, that had made up the armies that allowed the Carolingians to rise to power and to expand, to rebuild the old Merovingian Empire. They also began to say, okay, but we have to find a cure for the negative sides of these of this development, and the cure would have been indeed the building of a very solid statal power in a centralized fashion. So trying to counterbalance the push of the comital nobility for the eventual disgregation of the empire, and creating something more centralized, like maybe the Franks had learned from the Byzantines or other areas of southern Europe that that differently from the Latin Germanic world had were insisting on centralized traditions. For instance, the Arabs were doing that. The Caliphate of Cordoba was a big example, relatively close to Carolingian Francia. Even the Longobards who had created a state that was purely or at least, yeah, let's say we can say purely Germanic in political culture, had managed, because of the Roman influence, to create something more centralized. But the Carolingians were never able to do that, because not because they had, in part, obviously, they had pushed themselves for, that, progressive autonomization of local political entities, at least as a future consequence. But at the same time, that they had tried to establish into the same empire something that could last longer. And paradoxically speaking, the greater beneficiaries of these attempt was the church, or was the clergy. This is why the Carolingian Empire is such an important chapter that I like to talk about rather often, because you can argue that what we talk about in terms of Western culture was really born there. People really, sometimes for ideological reasons, tend to say, well, but the Carolingians were in fact that that strong influence for the birth of Europe. Europe was born in the Western, in the modern sense, in Western Europe with, I don't know, with with Luther, or maybe, you know, it was still a Roman influence for which. But really, if you look at that in perspective, the Carolingians really changed the whole game there. You know, if Europe had developed in a certain way, it's very fascinating to think, you know, what if the Carolingians had not existed? If the Merovingian Empire had remained essentially that thing that was nothing but a group of smaller kingdoms that quarreled between each other, and that he didn't have a great powerful initiative, we would have had this a vacuum, you know, within. I mean, not really a vacuum, but, you know, a huge area of Central Europe dominated by a series of small, you know, of small entities that really didn't have anything to do with the feudal ones that would came later after the same Carolingian, the disgregation of the Carolingian Empire. But here we're going a bit too far. And what I would like to talk about today is really, you know, trying to understand how the progressive autonomization and drift, in a way, of the of the Carolingian public authority really occurred. And considering especially also the you know, the characteristics of Carolingian society relatively to what it was to what Francia was before them, meaning that, as I was saying before, it's not that the Carolingians invented decentralization. If you look at the Merovingian kingdom, you see that things were very different, but at the same time the actual fragmentation of public authority was still there, and there were genetic characteristics in especially in Gallo-Roman society rather than the Frankish one, but even, yeah, no, definitely even in the Frankish one, but that you know, however, extend over this broader you know, Central European and Western European area that really obliged, in a certain sense, the Carolingians to carry out certain policies, such as the one of entrusting land to their own vassals and starting feudalism in a nutshell. And in this pattern, it's still very important to focus not just on what in this sense was decided at the top, at the Carolingian court, or within the Carolingian entourage, but in a certain sense what happened at the bottom, you know, at the basic level, of at the local level, where the actual the centralizing forces eventually took over at the end of the Carolingian Empire. And in this sense, in my videos I already talked about the importance of fortresses, you know, the process of so-called Encasalation. That is something that really happened, contrarily wise to what people tend to think or like to think today. It really didn't happen much because of invasions. You know, we have this very different this modern mind that has to conceive, you know, the rise of certain fortresses in a strategic sense, meaning that they were created from the above to manage a certain area that was under attack. And the phenomenon of Encasalation was really born out of a very autonomous and spontaneous movement that tended, rather than protecting or defending itself from invaders, that really came every once in a while and passing through places where, you know, only you know, very few fortifications would be attempted, most of which, by the way, didn't even survive, and that nobody rebuilt after the end of the invasions. The castles really rose for the need of local lords to control the local countryside, and this was really the main point. Even if you have this reign of Vikings, of Saracens, and of Hungars knocking at the at the Carolingian coffin, you can really see that the process of encasalation passed through other channels that were really part of what Carolingians had left within their own society. And together with fortresses, you have to consider every other kind of structure that could be used, not just from a military point of view, but even a strategical point of view from an economical perspective. For instance, the private churches and even the local monasteries that were usually private foundations. So they were created not out of pure, devotion or uninterested, and generous feelings, but because they were extremely useful tools for carrying out a very profitable patrimonial management and strategy. These were all, these were the means through which the local lords, coming from these, descending from the Carolingian counts, eventually could use even to develop their own local power, and in changing in turn the same fabric of post-Carolingian society. And we can see, coming back on the idea of the fortresses, the fact that the public crisis of the Carolingian Empire goes really in parallel with the rise of Encasalation, because the multiplication of fortresses really were something that the Carolingians had tried to stem, because they were in fact pretty autonomous initiatives. The counts to whom the Carolingians had entrusted fiefs or lands, at least, that had to be theoretically had to be given back to the king or the emperor once that the vassal had died, or even in any wished circumstance, because that land theoretically belonged to the king. Now, if you're a count and you have certain duties over that land, so you have to provide a certain amount of troops, a certain amount of resources, etc. It's pretty evident that a count, instead of doing this, and we instead started building a series of castles on his own soil, would be seen as someone who wasn't thinking at all about the public needs of the empire and and about what the king or emperor asked him, but he was really just trying to create his own small kingdom within his properties. And obviously Carolingians didn't want to do that, because in order to build a castle a lot of resources are needed. Surely there were castles built by the Carolingians especially along the marches, those frontier areas that had a very strongly military characterization from a strategical point of view. But if you were in the center of Francia, so far away from any foreign threat, The fact that you were creating a castle and investing resources on that instead than investing them on the aids required by your king or emperor, it was really seen as rightfully as something that was pushing towards the other direction. That is, in fact, the disgregation of the empire and not the strengthening of of public administration. So you can conceive as encasalation as sort of symptom cause or secondary cause of the transformation of the kingdom in a plurality of areas that tendentially and very differently autonomous were carrying out very autonomistic policies. And this is interesting because the encasalation implies, by the way, the idea of military control. So it's not that you build a castle just for nothing. Telling the truth, certain castles were built even to be sold. Now this might seem strange, but especially in areas where there was already a monetary economy on the rise, and the situation was quite complex, and there was a highly densely and there was a high density of population, like Italy, for instance. Castles would be built for military uses, but at a certain point it would be exchanged as goods, because those were areas so economically florid that could even make castles entering into the market But if you look at the general picture of post-Carolingian Europe, what you see is that most of the times, even in Italy, for instance, the encasalation started from this military, need of dominating the controlled zones, and this would imply a development of a series of social groups and and political systems that eventually would lead to the birth of European knighthood, for instance. So the idea that the lords would be a sort of military elite that had their own lifestyle and their own prerogatives. This is how it was practically born, because the aristocracies from which they eventually rose, this system rose, were exactly the post-Carolingian ones. So you start seeing appearing a sort of clienteles related to these former vassals of the king and emperors, and of armed groups called the Latin term is masnada, or masnata in Latin, that really means gang or band, or this idea of that in medieval sources it's normally related to an armed retinue. But masnata is much more than it's much I'd say the retinue implies that you are faithful to a lord. The masnata, especially in the the more you go on in time, is something that resembles more of a sort of mercenary company, an idea of a bunch of guys, of armed guys that sell themselves to the best offer and fight for him. But initially speaking, the masnata was within this post-Carolingian context was a group of armed family that were, as we recalled also in other videos, these literally familiars, or that had nothing to do with to relative relationships. It was much more of a of in fact of a group of serfs indeed, and who, by the way, were attached to many different characters, in the sense that these masnate in Latin were could really be at the service already at that time of many people. So that tells you immediately since the beginning how how varied the extraction of local lords really was about, because you see, the Carolingians had created a class of counts, of vassals, but it wasn't nothing homogeneous. There is still this messy idea that the clientelary system is really made up of many different people. There were nobles of ancient blood, maybe of Gallo-Roman origin. There would be bishops. There would be simple, even serfs, who simply for having fought well into a military campaign of the Carolingians could gain freedom and eventually even being entrusted with the comital title and lands, etc. So this diversity was really kept throughout the post-Carolingian period in the in the social section of the post-Carolingian world. The armed retinues could belong either to a great or little functionary. Because obviously, even in post-Carolingian times, the public authority, the public system had partly survived. So there were people who were entrusted with some offices by the local king, but they could be also, and these people could be, more people at once. I mean, if you were a functionary, you could even be a bishop or an abbot, or not, indeed. But there are also there is also a great group of the great private landowners. So people who, in many ways, had acquired a huge patrimony and began to to carry out seigneurial policies on their own. And this was the case that that really tells you how much political the public power in post-Carolingian Europe had expanded. Because one thing is that you expand because you're an official who is entrusted with some power, and then you abuse of that power to build something on your own. Another thing is being a no one. That maybe became rich through commerce or through other activities, and you would become so powerful to achieve such a huge power. Think about, for instance, now this is another this is chapter, and that really hasn't to do very much with the Carolingians, because it happened one century before. But think about the Frankish merchant Samus, or Samu, I don't remember the name exactly, but he was a guy that basically built up a huge dominion in today's lands of Czech Republic, Slovakia, Lower Austria, and Carinthia, etc. That became basically a king by just having made a fortune with his money. So this was a world, well, that happened at the border of the Frankish world that wasn't even so structured like in the Carolingian times. So it was easier to rise to power in more primitive environments, but through fortune and commerce, obviously. Even after the disgregation of the Carolingian Empire, that would have not been that easy, because of the public framework that still was up, theoretically speaking, so you couldn't reinvent yourself as a king of something in the core of France, because it was already, there were so many competitors, especially, that it was already a great thing if you could grasp, this and get these royal titles in places like Burgundy or Western Francia, etc., to build something completely different. And this is interesting, however, because it also tells you how the public framework really was pretty much a structure that you wanted to grow on, because you could be eventually legitimated with some title that belonged to that system. In other areas it's different, but it's especially from the lower fabric of post-Carolingian Europe that these autonomistic pushes rose. So sometimes even in a very small scale from a geographical point of view, but also in terms of political and military power. And I want to stress the diversity of this system, because we're not even talking about dominions that extended themselves, more than much, or that had even a territorial continuity. It was a pretty irregular frame through which these seigneurial lordships began to rise. Sometimes they rose one inside the other, which is very interesting. They had extremely diverse dimensions that all depended on the territory, the communities that inhabited it, on trade routes and political situation in the kingdoms at that time. And if you see that in detail, you're surprised by the fact of at how many levels the medievals could really play their cards, politically speaking. Because you could, pursue certain politics locally, then another one regionally, another one with that lord, another one with that other. So it was very dynamic as a system, and usually, however, there was a sort of gluing factor, or better, a common political language that was inscribed within those that Carolingian Vassallatic-Beneficiary and Vassallatic system, meaning that the relations between these lords would be normally nature. There wasn't much of a monetary circulation at that time, although the Carolingians had tried to re-put in motion something and achieving it in part. And by these sworn oaths of fealty that would eventually make up, the political gluing factor of feudal Europe, at least formally speaking. So personal fealty towards another lord, etc. But sometimes even without such ties, meaning that obviously there weren't just lords interacting with each other, were, for instance, local communities. Now, the local community is not a physical person. It's a political body that, however, has a very different culture, because as long as you're a layman, a lay lord, and you deal with another lord, maybe an ecclesiastical one, maybe an abbot or a bishop, you have a certain way of interacting. Probably the ecclesiastical lords would make much more use of written documents, and they would have places where to physically store them. Even the lay lords, the great private landowners, could have a lot of land, but not really, a stone building where to put documents, etc. The encasalation process we're talking about at this time is essentially mote and bailey. There weren't still the safe places where to store, goods or documents that you could use to boast your prerogatives. It was a largely rural environment, and also in terms of material culture. So the relations in this environment would be much more dynamic than compared to the one of the city or the monastery. And generally speaking, when we talk about peasants and peasant communities, they were quite active. This is also very important to remember, that the peasants weren't at this time those flattened class of serfs who really only obeyed to the lords. Certain peasants were quite violent, aggressive, and competitive themselves. Well, the peasants would essentially deal with lords without written documents. So even historically speaking, we lack a huge quantity of knowledge about certain relations, like the one I just mentioned, simply because they didn't leave us any source. It's already very difficult to find sources from that time for ecclesiastical entities. Let's imagine for what it concerns the peasantry. So sometimes the ties wouldn't even be so explicit, because it was very difficult even to understand in this quite messy puzzle of seigneurial dominions. How really political influence really changed. It was such a fast-moving system, a fast-evolving system, that even at those times the political dynamics took place even before they were sanctioned through some agreement. So there was a very dynamic play and a thick net of subordinations that could even just proceed only from the presence of a minor area within a greater one. So that the idea that there is a center and a periphery that are not to be meant merely from a spatial point of view, but in terms of political preeminence, and these kind of the supremacy could derive from comital or marquinal or ducal prerogatives, ducal titles, so fitting into that public system that still barely survived. But even during, in fact, within a kingdom, the idea that there was still a king, and the whole net of relations substantially depended in part by that king's power and influence. So it's very difficult to even imagine such a thing for our day. Where we are used since we are little to watch, to look at political maps and to see, this very neatly shaped border, and saying, this color is this place, and this state, and this community, and in this other color is another one. The High Middle Ages is a freaking mess of jurisdictions. And this would continue all over the Middle Ages, well into the modern, well, not even the contemporary era. Think about what Germany was before its unification. Even though over the centuries until the 19th century, the political geography of Germany had been simplified. It essentially was this intricate sum of many states that inhabited that made up politically that region of Europe. So it's a world. It's as if it was a fabric that was sewn into this moment. and that eventually influenced the rest of medieval society for all the Ancien Régime and beyond. I just wanted to add a note to which which is offering a perspective that it's not that the cause of this were really the Carolingians. As I was saying before, the Carolingians mostly rose to the power what was already available into Francia, and we have to think of the Merovingian kingdom as well, especially during the crisis of the 7th century, as something very similar, at least from a certain point of view, because the Merovingian lands weren't, so hadn't known this vassallatic system that exploded literally during the time of the Carolingians and that would develop further, etc. And they were lands that were, at least, however, already, tending towards that direction, because the local society was formed by very large estates, very large relatively to the rest of Europe. Gaul was the place in Europe in which the large estates had remained since the time of the Roman Empire, at least in Western Europe, because the transition of Gaul from the Romans to the Franks wasn't so traumatic like in other places, like in Italy with the Longobards or in Spain with the Arabs. So these huge estates that the Romans had created, especially in the Gallia Belgica, so incidentally that area that into which the Franks, not surprisingly, would have settled, were used to feed, which were used to feed the legions, originally speaking, to the Rhine legions, would be acquired by the local Frankish aristocracy that eventually intermingled with the Gallo-Roman one. So France, today's France at the time, was still pretty much, ready to see a development of large feudal estates from that base. And there already were many aristocrats in Gaul before the Carolingians took over, and who had developed similar intricate forms of interaction that resembled partly the one of the post-Carolingian age. And in many ways, these aristocrats would be essentially, at least in large part, the same people who eventually, developed their seigneurial policies of autonomization from public power in post-Carolingian times. This is very interesting because, these were the descendants of the same Gallo-Roman aristocracies. Gallo-Roman and Frankish aristocracies sometimes, and even if an injection of new aristocrats happened during the Carolingian time, in order to counter, by the way, partly the Gallo-Roman Frankish aristocracy, the two classes ended up to intermingle, to mix essentially, and to form even the seigneurial families of high medieval Europe. So this for saying that Carolingians basically accelerated a process that was really, I can't say that would have taken place anyway, but that really had very similar dynamics, originally speaking. And this genetic fault of the Carolingian world that made very difficult to build up a strong centralized public authority was partly belonging to the same Merovingian world. with the decline of the Merovingian dynasty and the development of the local aristocracies, especially in peripheral areas. So I hope it was a bit of a theoretical video, but I think it was useful to make you a bit better understand what I'm talking about when I say the autonomization, the disgregation, and all these words relatively to the public authority of the Carolingian world, because this is really the frame where the whole political game actually took place. So if you don't focus on this, it's very difficult to understand much of medieval Europe as a whole, and it is necessarily to be understood in some way. So thanks for listening as always, and if you liked this video, please share it or subscribe to my channel to receive further content, or just leave a like or a dislike. Maybe I deserve them as well. And I thank you very much again for listening, and I wish you a nice time, and see you next time. Bye.